Okay, so this little short talk is looking at content first in terms of web design and why that might be something that we would want to ensure. Okay, so a couple of things to just bear in mind and to consider when we're thinking about designing for the web. One is that the web is probably the most powerful platform for communication design on the planet. We've seen the web used in various different ways to communicate all kinds of pieces of information. Of course, most recently, fake news and those kind of things has been something that the web has been concerned about, but it is probably the most powerful platform for communication design on the planet. So foremost, the web is to communicate content, and I think that's something to really think about and why I think content first design is really important. So let's put a little bit of context in that to understand why we have arrived at this position and why it's really important if you're designing for the web today, how you might understand that. So obviously the web has a long history, and the first thing to understand is that the web is not desktop PCs anymore. That's certainly not the case. This is not how people consume the web anymore. The web is a lot more consumed in this fashion through a multitude of devices. In fact, users often will move between devices in different contexts, and we're going to cover contexts in this little talk as well. So that's something to bear in mind, that we have not only an ability to consume the web on different devices, but we often move between those devices, and those devices are changing depending on the situation we're in. And of course the web probably in fact is much more like this with our internet connected watches, fridges, cars and various devices. So we see this rise of what's called the Internet of Things, and so the web is coming through all of these different things and is consumed in different ways through these. And in fact some of the web is consumed purely through voice information, and that's for users who will be using Siri or other devices to communicate what the web, the content that's on the web, but through even a non-screen based device. So that's why content is really important, and it's the first thing you should consider when designing for the web. A couple of things that do obviously play into that context is these statistics here. So we've seen the use of mobile devices, so that's phones and tablets, outstrip the amount of use or than desktop devices. So we definitely see this as a trend, and if you were to plot those graphs, you can see that obviously one is going up and up and up. And so what's interesting here though is not to think about the now, but to consider the future. So where are these graphs going, and what might that mean for our content if it's going to be consumed? Here's some statistics about primary use. So mobile devices are primarily being used in time online, and Indonesia is over 90%. So this is really interesting. This is from ComScore. So again, there's lots of details there about the use of mobile devices, not just phones though. We need to remember that this is devices that are mobile, so this could and will be obviously watches and other devices that we carry on a person that are internet connected and that enable us to consume the web. Average time spent browsing on a smartphone. Here, this is particularly related to a smartphone. This is in a month, hours per month. Obviously, the UK 66 hours per month. The content is being consumed on a smartphone. So what often happens here is that people think, oh well, shouldn't it be mobile first? Well, that's one way of thinking about it, but actually if you take it another step away and abstract slightly more, it definitely should be content first, because we need to remember that content is the prime reason people come to a website, is to consume that content. They go to Facebook, wherever, Twitter, they're not going there because of the device they have, whether it be mobile or not. They're going there to consume the content. So if we work with the content first, we can work some things out. So the first thing to do is we should take care of the content first before we consider screen sizes and such. But it is obviously a good rule of thumb to consider that a lot of time online is spent via a mobile device, so phone and tablet. But rather than just think about screen size, there's lots of issues you need to think about in that instance. Obviously performance is really important, and the context that content is being consumed is super important. The other thing is to specifically remember that people are not spending a long time looking at stuff. So you have to, in fact, craft your content to be informative and to the point. Now, you want to do this for any experience, whether that be desktop or mobile. So at some point there was this kind of move to having these M.dot websites, which were mobile versions optimized for mobile. And a lot of the time they were missing content, or they weren't providing the same level of detail because they felt that would be the way to do it. But actually, if you take a really good approach to your content, you should be able to provide meaningful, communicative content that is both perfectly digestible on the desktop and the mobile, and then you consider different types of layouts. Okay, so just to end there with this section with this Rudyard Kipling quote, which is, "Words are of course the most powerful drug used by mankind." So we want to get that right. So the first step that we need to take in trying to work that out is to perform a content inventory. So we're going to apply this responsive design workflow to respond to people consuming the content in different ways. Then we should make an inventory, and that's like a simple list. So this is a book from Stephen Hayward's talking about making a simple inventory of what the content is. So that inventory just might be listing things that are on your current website or the current content you're working with to see how that starts to come together as an inventory. And then the bigger process to that is something that's called a content audit. So in a content audit, you take not just a simple list, but often it's built through sort of Excel spreadsheets that look a little bit like this, which might talk about the content of the page, what it is, who owns it, what are the details on that page. They can get pretty in depth, often, like I said, in these sort of Excel formats, which is akin to a database, and a database is used to house your content. So often these then are content management systems in themselves. In fact, there's a really good website called Gather Content, which allows you to sort of import your data, your content in, and has ways of actually using that straight into sort of design processes. So that's one way of doing that kind of content audit. Start with the inventory, and then an audit really is probably these Excel sheets with quite a lot of detailed data. There's another way of sort of putting this stuff together is use a sort of a description diagram. So here this would describe a particular piece of content and what would maybe be on there and how those things work. So this isn't about layout. Again, this is just about thinking about the content and what might appear there. Once you've performed that sort of content audit, you should be able to then develop a content strategy. So you can then use that strategy to create systems of navigating that content. What's really key to think about with the web is that you're not designing pages. Certainly the web is not page-based. At its best, a content strategy would define like key themes, key messages, recommended topics, like content purposes, whether there was some content gaps, what attributes that might connect, is there ways of optimizing search, how are there strategic recommendations on how you might make more content, how you publish it, etc. The other thing to think about is to really think about your content and how you might simplify that content. There's a couple of great books from the Standeasters called Microcopy, The Craft of Words, really short little books you can get on gumroad.com that really look at how the words we use are just as important in the design process. So that's why you want to start with the content to get that right. Another nice website is this one called voiceandtone.com. So this is from MailChimp, where they put together all of the kind of voice and tone that they would use in their content creation. So really, really nice. And of course, it enables them to then allow other people to generate content using the right types of language, and the right things that express that brand appropriately. Yeah. The other thing that's really, really important when starting with content first, obviously, is that you then can design with real content. So you can use, like I said, a tool like Gather Content that enables you, instead of having these sort of placeholder pieces with little blocks and whatever, to actually go through and use current or new real content. So here we've got like a little example of using on the left something that's called lorem ipsum, which is just Greek text that would be used, has been used a lot of the time. But what you can instantly see is that when you take that and actually start to apply, existing text to an event, you can start to see some big differences that have some impact. So, if there's multiple days, how does that change the layout? The name of the venue, getting some real names in there suddenly shows that are a lot longer than venue name. Yeah. And the same with the titles and the text. So suddenly, if we are playing with lorem ipsum content on the far left, our design is going to be massively transformed by the fact that when we input the real content. The other thing you can do is use current content that you've got while this content audit is being fine-tuned, or use competitors' content. Just don't use dummy content. It just won't work. The other thing to think about though is to edit ruthlessly. So with this content, really get down to the core of what is the message and the branding that you're trying to communicate through this content. And by doing so, you're going to provide a much better, more useful experience. The Swiss Army knife doesn't have all the tools that you'd find in the kitchen, because it would become an unyielding object to carry around. So think about who you're communicating with, what you're trying to communicate, and look at that. Think about this micro copy, and think about what kind of voice and tone might that copy have. So remember, the content is king, and you should start with content first. Yeah, compelling communication of that content is most important. Yeah. So Erin Kisan here said, in the web industry, anything that conveys meaningful information to humans is called content, and that's why we'd want to start with the content first. The other thing to think about before you start designing any sort of layout and those kind of things is to think about context. So if content is king, then think of context as the crown that sits on top of that content. Why is this important? Well, of course, with these mobile devices, we see, and here is just looking at the usage of daily impressions on a website, we see the usage changes depending on the context of the situation. So in the morning when someone first wakes up, they grab their iPhone. During the day, they might move to the desktop if they're a knowledge worker. They'll be sitting on the desktop during the day, and then in the evening, often people will have a second screen, and normally it's a tablet. They want to move to a slightly bigger device. With some of the slightly larger iPhones, then maybe they're just going back to those devices in the evening. But what you see here is a trend in regards to how that content is consumed, and they are switching between devices. So that's something to really think about. That's one of the contexts we might consider. There's loads of other contexts we need to consider. One of them is the fact that we are already cyborgs, and this changes and transforms the type of contextual information we have at our disposal when we're designing content for the web. So we carry around these mobile devices, and they give us these abilities that we didn't have before. They are augmenting us as people and turning us into cyborgs already. So here's a real quick list of some of the things to consider when someone has a mobile connected device. Again, it might be might be a phone, might be a Fitbit that needs to consume data from the web and present it back to the person. So they're personal. People don't share these devices. They're always on. People always try to charge them. We're always carrying them with us. Of course, then most of the time they're connected. Look at the new Apple Watch. It's got its own cell connection, so it can be used. You can address them directly, so you can send push notifications to them. They know where you are on the planet. They've got accelerometers. They've got gyroscopes. All these other things that sort of make you cyborg. They can, provide detailed information from calendars in that user's list. They can pull weather from devices. There's lots and lots of things that they can do. So you might want to think about the context in regards to helping those users. So here, this lady in the shopping mall in America, her context is that she's reading whilst walking. Not necessarily the right thing to do. But that context hasn't been considered. But this is what a lot of people actually do. So how might we, think about our content in that regard, and then onto our design in that regard? So what content do we need to provide? Do we need to have a motion detector and a proximity sensor so that our content changes to warn this user that she's about to get slightly embarrassed and slightly wet? Another thing to think about might be like searching for flights. Searching for flights on a desktop is one type of experience, but if that desktop or that mobile device understands your location, then the content provided could be very different. If that location is inside an airport, it's unlikely you're looking for new flights. You're probably, past security, looking to check on your flights. And so by understanding the context related to location, you can provide that. So think content first, and then context a close second for that content. So the activity is to take one of your most frequently visited sites and try to consider the content in terms of maybe an inventory list. Don't want to do a full content audit, and then consider them as a brand. What are they trying to communicate through their words and their content? So you can do a little bit of what's called a brand analysis to think about how are they? Are they very personal? Are they very corporate? Where do they sit in that sort of brand analysis? If you're not sure which sites to look at, here's a few. We've got some sort of pretty artisan websites there with some people who make custom denim, custom knives, etc., and a couple of organisations that have very particular tones of voices. So that's the activity for you to look at, and how you can digest that content, and how most likely in all of those instances the content was considered first, which then informed the strategy, then informed the design, and of course context filtered through all of that process.